So the forum today is about the making of progressive foreign policy. And what's strange about that is how recently, how very recently, that has become a major topic within the left progressive community. There's been a long silence, relatively speaking, extending really beginning in the Clinton years and maybe beginning before that, all through the Bush and Obama years, about with respect to foreign. There have been occasional moments, obviously the pre-war protests about Iraq and so on, but largely a silence about, from the progressive community, about what a progressive foreign policy would look like. And that's a mystery, which I won't try to solve here, but it does suggest that, which I think is germane to what we're doing here today, is that you can't have a progressive foreign policy without a progressive movement. And you really can't have a progressive movement without a foreign policy. And that's the sort of crux of sort of the premise of us gathering here today. I'm not going to go on anymore. I want to introduce our speakers. Aziz Rana wrote an article for New Labor Forum. It's actually in the current winter issue of the journal, which was the sort of semi-inspiration for this forum, precisely about this subject. He is a professor at the Cornell Law School. He has written for, stop that. His work, current work, folks, I got a great transition. His work centers on the changing relationship of race, citizenship, and empire, and the way those help to shape legal and political identity. He has published a book called The Two Faces of Freedom. He's working on a forthcoming book which will examine the way the Constitution became so venerated in the 20th century, and specifically during the alleged American century, and the impact that's had on popular politics. Here's the transition. He writes for many publications, including Salon, CNN.com, Jacobin, N+1, and The Nation. So that brings me to our to our next speaker, who you all know, but I'm going to say just a few words. Katrina vanden Heuvel is the editor and publisher of The Nation. She's a frequent commentator on all kinds of TV shows. She's a prolific writer for all the major media, including writing a weekly column for the Washington Post. She's published dozens, and not dozens, a lot of books. One of which, fairly recent, is called The Change I Believe in, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama. She's won many awards, including the American Rights at Work Award from the Eleanor Roosevelt Foundation, I guess, and the Norman Mailer Center Award for Distinguished Magazine Publishing. She's on the board of the Institute for Policy Studies and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and on and on. So I've done that. Now, here's what we're going to do with a little bit different format than is customary, usually here. These speakers are not going to give opening formal presentations. Instead, I am going to ask them a series of questions. They're very difficult, big questions. They do not, I know the answers to them, but they do not. Really, nothing's fixed here. So we're going to do that and see how that goes, and then at 10 o'clock we'll open the floor up to you and for your questions. So let me begin. The first question is, it is customary, conventional, when anybody practically talks about foreign policy, to talk about it in terms of the national interest. That phrase is always at the center. Well, from a progressive point of view, I'm asking both of them, how would you define, what is the national interest, especially emerging out of a society that couldn't be more fissured and divided and full of social confrontation? And I'm going to ask Aziz to begin, and then Katrina will talk.
Hello. So first, I'd just like to say thank you to all the organizers for putting this event together, to Steve, to Paula, to Michael, and also to the folks like Andrea that worked on the essay that's in the current issue of New Labor Forum. And it's wonderful to share the stage as well with Katrina. Okay. Can folks hear me? And it's wonderful, too, to share the stage with Katrina. So I look forward to the conversation. So I'm not a nationalist. And what that means is I'm deeply suspicious of the idea that there's such a thing as a national interest, or that conceiving of it and organizing politics around it is a fruitful avenue for left social movements and initiatives. My basic view is that there are fundamental conflicts in American society between groups that are oppressive and those that are oppressed. There are a number of different kinds of cleavages, and that the language of the national interest, especially when it comes to foreign policy, does a huge amount of work to essentially paper over these conflicts and create a fictitious account of a harmonious we the people. This is a view that had been a fairly central perspective within left politics for large chunks of the American past, particularly in the early parts of the 20th century. That figures within the labor movement oftentimes understood foreign policy as something that had to be independent from the security objectives of the state. So that labor had to have its own independent foreign policy. Within the black freedom struggle, there had to be an independent black foreign policy based on the idea that who you're in solidarity with is not necessarily bound to who you share national identity. That it might be the case that your solidaristic attachments are with communities abroad, whether or not they're American. And I think just concretely we can see the problems of the focus on the national interest and how Trump, for example, has claimed a kind of economically populist space, especially when he talks about trade. So Trump's trade talk about tariffs is all about this idea that there are certain kinds of threats to a nation-based working class. But for all of the kind of heterodoxy behind the idea, who is it that's in fact the threat? It's members of a working class abroad. It's foreign workers that are somehow threatening the jobs of domestic workers, rather than the structure of American capital and its domestic abettors, where in point of fact, like his tariff policies are really a grab bag of payoffs to corporate interests in a way that cleaves and cuts class solidarity. And so, my basic thought or worry is that if we persist in using this language as a way of thinking about foreign policy, essentially what we're going to do is be blind to the communities that folks that are oppressed domestically are actually in solidarity with, and make it very difficult to conceive of what a social movement-based foreign policy would be. So I don't think countries have foreign policies. I think labor has a kind of foreign policy that would link it to other communities that it's activity with abroad. And to the extent that you're thinking about the state, then the politics should be, well, how is it that you constrain and control the state so that it engages in a global politics of mutual self-restraint and actually facilitates the objectives of communities domestically?
So I wanted to thank the organizers as well, especially Paula and Steve. My ulterior motive for being here is to make sure that Aziz writes more for the nation. And there are many people in this audience, including Bob Dreyfus, who should be up here, not me. But this is a vexing question. When Steve Fraser opened our conversation, I guess a week ago, and said we're going to start with this, I think Aziz put it very powerfully. I think in a society scarred by systemic racism and sexism, the idea of a national interest may be an oxymoron. If you do think, or try to think of the national interest more in the context of synonymous with the public interest, there is the possibility of putting social and economic dignity at the center of that, but you still have the stress of even the fundamental values which we speak of, justice, equity, freedom, can be upended, deformed, diffused by a nationalism that is so pervasive at this time. I guess I would say, at the risk of being heretical in a left-wing forum this morning, The four freedoms have a tortured history in some ways, but there is something to freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of worship that speaks to an animating part of the less nationalist American history. And I would say, picking up on what Aziz spoke of, one thing that has been a through line in the nation's history, truly a through line, is that you cannot have democracy or sustain freedom at home in the global context if it's shaped, a global context shaped by militarism, racism, corporate power. So I don't have an easy answer because I think it's a question that continues to need to be debated, and I will leave it at that.
Thanks. So, can you hear this? Aziz, would you like to respond to any of what Katrina said, maybe particularly this four freedoms idea? You want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, so.
Did that work?
Yeah.
Now it's working?
So, I guess my view about this is that I think it's really important to think seriously about what was emancipatory and what was problematic about the New Deal order. And the heart of what was emancipatory was the effort to take seriously the principle of social democracy and conceive of it as something that applies domestically to everybody and globally as a kind of basic condition of a world order. And in that way, I think that principles of social democracy should be at the heart of not only a domestic agenda that ties things like Medicare for all to the Guaranteed Jobs program, but also how the U.S. conceives of its role abroad or internationally. So, reversing the focus on austerity and neoliberal economic policies, privatization, the presumptive right of corporate property rights that are understood to be transnational and unconstrained, confronting tax havens. So there's an entire way of thinking of one element of the New Deal vision as bound to what should be pursued in the present. The problem with the New Deal order, among many problems, so there's a domestic issue of the extent to which this was actually a universal aspiration meant for racial politics in the U.S., status of farm workers, domestic workers. But along with that, one very significant problem was the way in which the idea of a global New Deal, you see this explicitly with, let's say, the Marshall Plan, something that Ted Furtick has written about in N+1, was married to war making, to American empire. And in a sense, the presumption was that the U.S. is a globally unique and exceptional nation. It enjoys international police powers and global primacy. Its interests are the world's interests, and it has a right to intervene to reconstruct the domestic politics and internal economies of foreign states. And that the condition of the spread of the New Deal project was the spread of a particular kind of American power. Now, in a global confrontation with with Nazi Germany, there's a real moral power to this. But as the Cold War proceeded, based on, one of the principles, this is in a way an extension or outgrowth of freedom from fear, it became very closely associated with a set of national security and economic prerogatives that I consider quite problematic for the long-term fate, essentially, of both left politics in the U.S., but also the specific position of labor. And in a way, I think the contemporary problem is to figure out how to take that social democratic impulse and extract it from an imperial or war-making one. Is it possible in the U.S. to have a politics of social democracy that is not bound to a politics of empire? Now, that's actually been the struggle of left politics. It's something that distinguishes the left social movements, folks like from IWW or W.E. Du Bois and elements of African-American freedom struggle, from kind of like the central figures within what becomes the New Deal and Cold War security establishment. And so that's kind of the tension that we have to struggle with right now. And I'd say that, this will be the last thing I'll note, that labor itself, and especially the traditional labor movement, has had its own kind of problematic space within this story. That if you look at the AFL-CIO, Walter Reuther in the 40s and 50s, the traditional labor movement made a pact with the security state based on just this division, which is a commitment to the security objectives abroad, a defense of social democracy at home. And some of this had a kind of ethical power. I mean, the power came from the thought that, well, you know, the US faces these existential enemies and that these are authoritarian regimes. But the long-term consequence, I think, of this pact, both pragmatic and ethical, was that it really undermined the foundations of what would be various kinds of cross-national solidarities, as well as the policies themselves when you unleash a kind of militaristic capital.
You know, Aziz has already, no good? Oh, that's good, yeah. More than touched on the next question I wanted both of you to respond to. So I won't ask you to come back on this because it's going to be the same thing. The question is this. Look, Aziz's article makes the case that for a long, long time, foreign policy was sequestered off by itself, the business of experts, not talked about widely as part of our sort of democratic polity, and so on. Of course, and then domestic policy proceeded along its own track. That is beginning to end. One of the ways it's ended is we owe gratitude to Donald Trump, because "Make America Great Again" is simultaneously I like the guy. What can I say? Is simultaneously a foreign policy and a domestic policy all at the same time. And as Aziz has more than suggested, for a long time that was implicit. That is to say, we went abroad in defense of, the United States went abroad in defense of free enterprise, freedom, and equality, and capitalism. That was the foreign analog to our domestic life. Our domestic life was perfectly organized by those categories, and we need to export it. So the question is, what should be the relationship between a progressive domestic policy and a progressive foreign policy, and what concrete indications are there already afoot that might begin to display that? And Katrina, I'll begin with you.
I think everyone in this room knows there's enormous energy in progressive movements, domestic movements, but I don't think you can achieve a fundamental progressive transformation at home without a progressive transformation of foreign policy. And I think Aziz spoke very clearly about how do you extract a social democratic foreign policy and cut out, you know, the imperialism, the interventionism. I think we're seeing the beginnings of an understanding among movements. You see it, Black Lives Matter in their manifesto, Our Revolution. There are others, but it's just the beginning of the ferment. But there is a full understanding that if America is going to police the world, if America is going to have a defense budget that isn't $750 billion, as William Hartung wrote at The Nation last week, it's closer to $1 trillion. You can't liberate, you can't free resources that will be needed to rebuild, to invest, for the public investments. This is not new. I mean, the bread and butter debates of the Vietnam War era should remind us of the power and importance of a progressive foreign policy. So we need one that, a progressive foreign policy that frees us from military commitments, from policing the world, from misadventures. There's also this idea, and this veers in, again, heretically into sort of a kind of progressive realism, a humane realism, but the idea that America leads best by its own example, not precept, by not going out abroad in the world and imposing. I think we would do well to rebuild our own country, not in isolationist impulse, but to rebuild our country, reinvest in our country while we, and this will be a question we're going to talk about, rebuild, reimagine, rethink the kind of multilateral commitments and institutions that have been in large part discredited, need reimagining, and would play a role. I think one issue we need to grapple with, and this is a place to, and we'll come to it, is, you know, someone once said an indestructible weapon system is one that is based in all 50 plus states, and I think the idea, put aside of just transition, a term that many of you know, but to come back, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, to Seymour Melman and Conversion 2.0, to find ways to create jobs in communities around this country that are not necessarily bought into the military-industrial complex. In fact, increasing number of surveys and polls show Americans are war-weary. They're weary of these wars without end, and they seek alternatives. But there are jobs in communities at stake, and I think one needs to be attentive to that.
Yeah, so I think this is a really remarkable moment in the life of, obviously in the life of the country, but also in the life of thinking about alternatives to the national security establishment when it comes to foreign policy for a number of reasons that kind of join together. One is the way in which the kind of forever wars that we've seen over the last 15 years plus, with the Iraq War in a sense at the center, where you have failed intelligence as the basis for truly regional catastrophe, delegitimize the national security establishment as the grown-ups in the room. So you have that as a significant factor. You have the fact that, as Steve was noting, that Trump himself, the language of America First, though it's grounded in the account of racial enemies, of a xenophobic nationalism, is articulating a type of alternative to the established Cold War imperialist policies that have dominated American politics. And in articulating an alternative, in running in the Republican Party as effectively the anti-war candidate, has opened up a space to think and talk about these issues. Then you also, I think, have the collapse of a conventional wisdom among Democratic politicians. This would be the third element that's really marked the last 45 years of American policy. So it's not like there haven't been anti-imperial voices in the US. I mean, that's been a constant theme. It's that those anti-imperial voices have had no space in mainstream politics and in electoral politics. And the lesson that the Democratic Party took really from, let's say, 72 and McGovern's defeat, because in many ways McGovern ran not just as an anti-war candidate, he ran as a candidate opposed to the Cold War, was that you can't win successfully by seeming to not be like a national security hawk, tough on national security. And that, as James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. Democrats talk about the economy, they avoid these questions of national security. And in a sense, I think we've come to the close of that particular period where it's key that some element of support for a variety of different candidates that have won national office, including Obama, though that was a kind of failed promise, was because there were anti-war candidates and were running in various ways contrary to national security voices. That's three. The fourth and final one I'll note is that, unlike in the past, the U.S. now truly has no existential threats. It was much harder to sustain an anti-imperial social democratic left position in the context of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, where you can make plausible claims about existential confrontation. The kind of openness about the global context means that that kind of red baiting is just harder to pull off, though the right continues to do. And what it means is that there's now space for thinking about principles, and the principles are the same that folks have been discussing for a long time in terms of how the left should be oriented to the state. One, economic policy should be built around global social democracy. So that means, for example, ending tax havens, ensuring that you have multilateral and regional arrangements that actually constrain the power of corporations to oppress their own domestic labor supplies, that impose environmental standards, that impose limits on what happens down the supply line, that actually prosecutes individuals for their own behavior. And then corporate actors. And that leads to the second principle that's been a central one, which is an idea of do no harm. This is the thought that the state should be organized around a principle of constraint. And that applies both in terms of the use of force, that you don't begin with the presumption that the state should be in the business of either applying sanctions or engaging in various kinds of militaristic interventions, but think instead about, well, what are the actual costs of various actions? And that do no harm principle is tied both to a commitment to limit the kinds of violence that our own allies engage in. So here, especially Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Middle East, but globally. So place limits on the violence that our allies engage in, but then also take seriously principles of self-determination for local communities, and also an anti-impunity commitment, which is that if you're committed to the notion of do no harm, then if your own government actors, let's say like the person the head of the CIA, engages in brutal violations of domestic international law, there should actually be consequences for it, for your own actors and for allies abroad. And then the third principle is a commitment to really demobilizing the national security state, both in terms of the budget, but also just the general global and domestic foothold of a kind of coercive security apparatus that in a way should be thought in parallel with demobilizing the carceral state. And we can get into what these principles might mean in practice, but they're a basic framework. And for now, though, as Katrina noted, the only way to get this off the ground is to think about how these ideas can be understood as part of like the daily political lives of ordinary people, how they can be read as not distinct, like a distinct domain of expertise, but part of the same struggle for things like, Medicare for all, that they can be read in materialist terms as a unified set of demands that affect both what the U.S. does at home and what it does abroad.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're at this extraordinary moment, and Aziz is right, that the bipartisan foreign policy establishment is discredited. But that demands activist constituencies, that demands movements to drive forward that, to show how discredited they are, because Washington is a glacial institution. And there is, as you lay out the first principles, but it will demand progressive movements committed to some of what you described, Medicare for all. A Green New Deal begins to engage globally and domestically, to link, to fuse, and that is vital. But what's also needed, and you've written about this, Aziz, is an institutional infrastructure, an intellectual infrastructure, which this room, but you need those activist constituencies to drive forward the principles you're talking about. I think it's an important moment in our history that you talked about holding accountable the brutality of our allies, so, quote allies, the Yemen vote, the invoking of the War Powers Act for the first time in years, the reassertion of congressional a role in matters of war and peace. I think that shows some life in the body politic, but it needs to be driven forward in ways that I still, you talked about how the three anti-interventionist candidates, anti-interventionist in a mainstream way, won last elections. But then look at President Obama. He comes in with a team that is largely devoted to the kind of liberal interventionist establishment program. And I think building a bench is going to be vital in this next period, not just intellectually, but in the progressive community. And that has been missing, and that has cost us in ways. I see in Bernie Sanders' campaign, if I could just be local for a moment, but you have, everyone fixes on Matt Duss, who's his foreign policy advisor, but there's a man named Keen Bott, who was working with the Progressive Caucus, which, by the way, is a valuable entity in the House, 100 members strong, not all of them truly progressive, but many of them would sign on to what Aziz is talking about. Ro Barbara Lee, there are others. But Keen Bott worked with the caucus, and he was central to the Yemen vote. He's now working with Sanders. But I think that we've missed a generation, and we're going to have to build that out, and that's the work that I think is critical.
I said to Aziz, I want to move, but really it's very related. The question I'm about to ask is already on the floor, and that is, let's be real for a second and even more concrete. Trump is criticized for going it alone, right? Unilateral this, unilateral that, et cetera, among other things. And the virtuous, better, wiser position is to rejoin the international diplomatic and defense community, proceed multilaterally, and so on. How does a progressive government, let's forget about the movement for a second, okay? We're in power. What does it do about NATO, for example? What does it do about the whole range of international institutions which actually effectuate that foreign policy abroad, the IMF, et cetera, and so forth? Who are our allies? Is Angela Merkel an ally, and so on?
So the way I read the Trump moment is not just as a break, but really as a continuation of a steady American defection from the international legal order that it played a central part in constructing in the 40s and 1950s. And you can tell the story, you know, essentially from the early 90s to the present, where the U.S. participates in negotiating treaties but then doesn't sign up to them, where the U.S. develops a language in the 90s of rogue nations that should be rightly subject to unilateral attack that becomes the language of preemptive attack and invasion during the Iraq War. And that this steady defection is a massive problem for global security, and it's also a massive problem for any politics that's committed to military de-escalation and a world that's organized by constraint and peaceful organization. And I think one of the central principles of progressive government should be, you know, it's hardly a radical position in theory, but actually applied in practice, it has truly radical effects, which is the U.S. should bind itself to the global obligations that it's played a central role in constructing. And if you just list what some of these implications might be, they're quite dramatic. In other words, you know, we shouldn't have drone strikes in the context of undeclared armed conflicts. You only use that kind of that kind of military action in the context of an armed conflict. We should not be providing arms to countries that are systematic human rights abusers and engage in massive war crimes. We should end military aid to states like Israel and Saudi Arabia that are themselves engaged in various acts of impunity. We should, in fact, count comprehensively and transparently the civilian casualties and conflicts that we're involved in. We should commit, as we've done in our own international agreements, to nuclear disarmament and significant arms reductions more generally. We shouldn't use economic sanctions. So Nicholas Mulder in The Nation has written really powerfully of the way in which economic sanctions is truly war by other means. It's weaponized. It's what Nixon called making the economy scream. It affects a quarter of the world's population, has dramatic impacts on, on GDP, as well as escalates internal inequality in ways that have no tangible effects on those that are like truly engaged in authoritarian or oppressive practices. So all of these are straightforward calls to stand in commitment with the U.S.'s own international obligations, to rather than defect from the international order, to see oneself as in fact limited by constraint, and to think seriously about regional multilateral ways to ensure that our allies too are limited by constraint. Now notice, the contemporary politics that you get out of the traditional Democratic Party and the so-called kind of like Obama progressive wing that talks about diplomacy, they're not going to go to these particular ends. And the reason why is that for all of the discussion of diplomacy, we should spend more money on the State Department, that there should be more of an investment in soft rather than hard power. There is nonetheless a background set of commitments. It's a commitment to American primacy, to the idea that the U.S. can rightly move in and out of international agreements because it's a kind of global backstop. There's a commitment to international police power, and there's a commitment to a set of strategic alliances in the Middle East, for example, organized around oil, the war on terror, and our connections with Saudi Arabia and Israel again. And to the extent that you have those background commitments, and you ultimately think of international law and legal constraint as something that's provisional, that can be repudiated or rejected based on the domestic judgments about national security, authority, or quote-unquote the national interest, you're going to end up just going back into the same cycles of violence. It's one of the reasons, besides the fact that there hasn't been a left bench effectively in the Democratic Party, which has essentially both domestically and internationally been eliminated from the party. So that's one reason why the Obama administration, Obama ends up turning over foreign policy to Clinton and Biden and Samantha Power. But another reason is because at the end of the day, the folks around Obama essentially believed in the same principles. And if you believe in the same principles, then you have the same policy effects. And so at the very minimum, a progressive government when it comes to foreign policy should say, well, let's take seriously the international legal constraints that are meant to shape a multilateral order organized around peaceful demilitarization and mutual toleration and recognition as a basic bedrock.
So we sit here today as the Iran deal, and Bob Dreyfus has been writing about it for us, is being shredded. The Paris Accords were not sufficient, but they were important. So multilateral diplomacy is surely preferable to unilateral interventionism, but I think the project of a progressive foreign policy is to reimagine, radically reimagine and review these institutions. I think there's been too much nostalgia for a liberal international order that never was and failed in many ways. I'm thinking, G7, NATO, IMF, and I think that it's imperative that a progressive foreign policy, as Aziz laid out, thinks of these institutions as constraints on American power, as ways to de-escalate, as ways to demilitarize. Aziz has written, and I've thought a lot about this, that there were alternatives at the end of the Cold War, the Second Cold War. Aziz cites Václav Havel and Gorbachev on NATO. NATO was designed to counter the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, yet NATO has moved forward, has expanded in ways that has escalated militarization of our foreign policy, and that has made our world more dangerous. It has now become imbued by a foreign policy establishment as a haven for democracy and spreading of democratic values. I think this is very dangerous. So I think a progressive foreign policy needs to understand the international power of international agreements that express a transnational solidarity, that express an anti-militarism, anti-interventionism, but be very careful about buying into this return to the liberal norms and orders and the democracy that was, because it's a call for a return to a status quo, to a restoration kind of foreign policy, when in fact what we need is a radically reimagined foreign policy and multilateral institutions at the center of it, as I think is critical.
That I couldn't agree more, and I thought that's really well said about about NATO, which is the goal at the end of the Cold War in '89 was, well, now that you don't have this tense relationship with the Soviet Union, how do we create alternative multilateral institutions that de-escalate conflicts and demilitarize Europe and the US's relationship? And instead, what the US ends up pursuing is privatization in Eastern Europe and Russia and the expansion of NATO. Now, this is not meant as an alibi for Putin and Russia, an authoritarian, deeply problematic regime. But it's certainly the case that this tense relationship with Russia, I think, facilitated and strengthened the hard right in Russia, and has also created more conflict rather than less. So at the very least, if we're not going to engage in a rethink about NATO itself, which I would support, that we shouldn't be in the business of backing the expansion of it. And we should also, take a very a serious look at our relationship with Germany and with Angela Merkel. Germany's role over the last decade plus has been central in promoting austerity, in undermining the politics of social democracy in places like Greece, Portugal, Spain, etc., and imposing a set of neoliberal economic constraints that, again, have starved the state of the capacity to address domestic poverty while engaging in this kind of remilitarization of relationships.
I think Eric Foner, who's on our editorial board in the context of some other discussion, said, retrieve your own country's history, I think it's worth retrieving the alternatives that were lost. And one of those was this idea that we would not have NATO, but we would have a common European home stretching from Vladivostok to Lisbon, something Gorbachev spoke of. But I think the key, and this is something that should be present in this presidential campaign, should be a focus on how do we prevent war, not how we wage war. And I think the discussion of multilateral institutions, reimagining them, should be on the agenda, should be a question to candidates, because there should be new institutions at in this period of ferment that speak to a social democratic, demilitarized, de-escalating kind of foreign policy. You need the institutions, as you've written about. I mean, institutional infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, I come back to that, and movement infrastructure. And it's a focus that movements could pay some attention to, that would speak to their principles and drive it into a foreign policy arena.
Let me ask a related question. Katrina's alluded to the 60s, the progressive movement of that day, which was simultaneously one that addressed, obviously, questions of foreign policy and the domestic life of the country in various ways. The left, the progressive world, at that time identified with and allied with anti-imperial movements around the world. Something has happened over the last 25, whatever it is, years. The basis for such alliances has shriveled, doesn't not exist, but a lot of what is anti-Western, let us say, is not that anti-imperial movement we, the progressive world, long identified with. What's the significance of that? If you're building this new international order, who are you going to ally with? How do you get out of NATO? In other words, where are the forces that make that possible? Is that a problem for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of reasons for the decline of an anti-imperial left internationalism. And one of the reasons that really shouldn't be that shouldn't be ignored is what happened with Third World liberation. So you had an era, roughly spanning really from, let's say, the 40s and 50s to the 70s, where what it meant to be a left internationalist in the US was, again, to see the national interest as a kind of fiction, to understand the world is driven by these fundamental conflicts, and to make alliance with anti-colonial forces abroad. And there was a real power to those because of the way in which independence actors represented domestic communities and were engaged in an emancipatory struggle. And then what ended up happening for lots of different reasons is both the end of the era of decolonization, but also the growing authoritarianism of the first generation of independence leaders. And it was very difficult, to maintain that kind of solidaristic politics when what you're saying effectively is you're in support of or you're defending the sovereignty of Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And that's posed a very specific problem for the left in the present. I'd want to think about it in a couple ways. First, we shouldn't romanticize this. In other words, even during that era, it was super hard to know who you should be in solidarity with. Like which anti-colonial or socialist faction in Angola is actually the emancipatory faction. You'd have to have like really profound knowledge about the internal politics on the ground to be able to negotiate these problems. And so there's a kind of persistence of the difficulty of figuring out how to organize solidarity on the international domain that in some ways just also mimics the question of how do you create popular fronts and who are you a fellow traveler with domestically. So there was always that problem. And then let's say if that problem is now accentuated because you don't have, you don't have these sort of incipient progressive bases, then I think what it means is that internationalism now can't just be about defending the absolute sovereignty, let's say, of authoritarian states, but it has to be grounded in two kinds of approaches that I already sort of mentioned. One is really focusing on, well, what would actual self-determination mean for communities? And oftentimes, what that means in practice is that the US plays a less heavy-handed role in intervening within the domestic struggles of foreign states and freezing disputes or picking winners, but actually comes at these conflicts from a position of restraint. And we can think about that even right now in terms of what's happening in Venezuela. Like it's, you can't really, it's very hard to talk about like Maduro as some kind of progressive figure because that's just not true. But at the same time, a politics that takes seriously self-determination would say the U.S. should not be in the business of using economic sanction or implicit coup politics to overthrow foreign governments. Now, this is one of the ways in which like the liberal imperialists, like the Obama folks, have been able to claim a kind of high ground because it's much easier to say, well, do something, use force, claim that like we're acting on the side of the people on the ground when we go in and overthrow a government like Gaddafi in Libya. Now, of course, the effect is like deeply destructive for the local population. It's much harder to say, well, actually taking seriously solidarity means restraining the state from exercising these kinds of actions. And then the second thing I'll say is that there are actually incipient progressive movements. Yeah. And this is one of the things that I think the Sanders folks have done well since 2016, which is, well, think about, especially in relationship with parties like Podemos or the politics out of Greece or what's happening in England with Corbyn, how is it that you create a kind of left international bloc? So there's that space too.
I come back to what, Aziz has spoken of and others have thought of is, do no harm is an important concept. I do think, I'm glad you referred at the end to sort of not just the international, transnational solidarity, Podemos and Momentum and Corbyn, but people's movements in these countries. It's not just the state, it's the movements that if there can be found a way to kind of weave together a new socialist international, for example, which does exist but flounders. There was a moment, if there was any silver lining to the Iraq war of aggression, which there wasn't, it was that the administration, Bush administration, averted its eyes from our backyard, from Latin America. And there was that moment of a rise of a kind of populist leftism in Latin America with all of its flaws. But there was, that has dissipated in corruption, in force fields, in the, the rise of forces like Maduro. But I do think the triumph of neoliberalism also played a role in eradicating the forces of a kind of anti-imperialist, quote, third world left. And I think, again, what has been discredited, what has been exposed as bankrupt is this bipartisan foreign policy establishment, as has neoliberalism. But, zombies can keep on moving for long periods of time, and I think it's our work to continue not only to expose, but to struggle against.
So I'm going to ask just, I think, one more question. We're getting close to 10 o'clock, and I know everybody here wants to participate. So the question is, we're in power. Do we have a defense budget? What's it for? Do we dismantle the whole nuclear arsenal? The United States will remain a great power even after we take over. What does it mean to engage in great power diplomacy under those circumstances? And is the defense budget that we the leftists for a long time said, yeah, use this money to do other things, which is domestic stuff, which is true. But is there a defense budget, and what do we use it for?
Actually, we were just talking about this. First thing I'll say is that there's a terrific essay in The Nation that came out this week that talks specifically about the defense budget and the fact that it's, in fact, something like $1.25 trillion, and then actually marches you through the different elements of it. So 550 billion plus for defense itself, something like 80 billion for intelligence, 70 billion for the Department of Homeland Security. I'm sorry? In The Nation. So the Yeah, so this is May 7th, and I recommend reading it. So, you know, my general politics of the left is I'm really interested in what's called non-reformist reforms or revolutionary reforms, which is not thinking about social change as, you know, Sanders is in office and now we have like the utopian revolution, but instead thinking about like, well, what are concrete steps that could be taken that make it harder to reproduce the existing status quo, both when it comes to, you know, domestic power relationships, but also when it comes to the U.S.'s role in the world. And that's the way that I would approach, you know, linking domestic and foreign and thinking about the defense budget, which is, well, you know, there's a huge problem with essentially giveaways of like military equipment to contractors that are utterly disconnected from the actual defense of the country. Those should be eliminated. There are massive issues of waste that are tied to the dramatic privatization of how the national security state operates. That should be significantly curtailed. There are actual institutions that are deeply coercive and, in my view, serve no function outside of engaging in like the surveillance of marginalized and oppressed communities, whether they're immigrant or Muslim. Those should be eliminated. For example, we can think about how border enforcement works. That is certainly part of this question of national security. And then you can go down the line. I mean, I would say one thing as both caution and as highlighting the need to think about the domestic and the foreign together, which is one of the ways, maybe the only way, or one of the significant ways that the New Deal lives on in the present without us being aware of it is through the defense budget. In other words, there are whole communities in this country that are in a kind of vice grip tied to the infrastructure of military spending, where this vice grip both means that these are communities whose children have been killed or scarred by the wars that the U.S. fights abroad, but also that the basic economic function of the towns are based on defense spending. And if you're going to be in the business of these dramatic decreases, even the decreases that I just discussed, it has to, just as a fundamental condition, be tied to something that's like a, you know, a neo-WPA or a New Deal. In other words, it cannot function separate from a freedom budget that uses that money to rebuild not just the communities that we might ordinarily think of, but also those communities in particular. And then the other thing I'd say is this also speaks to what Katrina's been talking about, which is you need a social movement politics that sees this as part of, let's say, Medicare for all, but you also need an intellectual infrastructure, like think tanks, policy experts, folks that can actually produce white papers on topics. And a conscious function of the Democratic and Republican parties over the last half century has been to starve and eliminate this kind of institutionalized feature of left foreign policy. And then precisely because it does not exist, to say, see, the left, the anti-imperial left just has pie-in-the-sky ideas and they don't have concrete objectives. And the reason why, in part, is because there's no intellectual base that would staff these agencies, that would think about how to transform them, that would serve as a National Security Council.
So every year for the last decade or more, the Project for Defense Alternatives, which is Bill Hartung's group, has laid out a budget which is just slicing the defense budget in half, and that we remain secure. Part of this, the more fundamental question, is how we define security. Because I think on some level, we've lost sight of the fact that the climate crisis may be the greatest security challenge we face, and that militarized responses to these challenges are not what is needed. So you have that, you have the blueprints, you just don't have the openings, as you said, social movements need to drive. I come back again to this conversion idea. Seymour Melman 2.0, I'm working with Robert Poland, an economist, and a group. If you took some of this money and put it in healthcare and education, it's a far more productive investment. And years ago, I don't know if people remember William Wimpensingher. He was allied, it was the machinist union. He was fully on board. He pushed a congressman named Ted Weiss. There was legislation on the floor of the House for conversion. So I think that's vital. I will say, in redefining security, we're at a very difficult moment. I mean, Aziz spoke of how we don't face existential threats. Well, the national security strategy laid out early this year has downgraded counterterrorism, or terrorism and counterterrorism and fighting it, and has elevated Russia and China as the two, quote, existential threats to our security. What does that mean? It means many things, but it means a lot more money for people like Patrick Shanahan. And the obscenity of having essentially a military contractor running the Defense Department, I think, illuminates what we confront. But I do think one could mobilize social movements around cutting the defense budget, because if you don't liberate, literally liberate hundreds of billions of dollars from the defense budget, it will be difficult to fund the programs, the social programs that make America truly secure.
I want to thank our speakers. Open the floor to questions. I think the way they like to do it at the school, is that what you want to do? Okay, I'm going to call on 3 people to ask questions, and then you can address them to either or both of our panelists, and then we'll listen to that and go on. So.
And Steve, we're going to ask people to come and line up here. Okay. Unless you have, if there's a accessibility issue, just keep your hand raised and we'll bring a mic to you. But if you can, please line up and use this microphone here. Thank you.
So raise your hand, please. 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. I've come to a lot of these forums, and I'd like to speak to the elephant in the room, and that is we talk about forming a government that is responsive to the people progressively, and yet the way we form our government, our election system, is blatantly non-representative. And I point out the fact that the last election, there were about 90 million votes cast, but about 60 or 70 million people who were eligible to vote didn't vote. So what about all the people who don't vote? Is it a fair system? And I'm not talking about popular vote, because systematically, mathematically, I did a little study, and you only need 150 people to elect the President of the United States. There's no minimum. 3 people in each state. Whoever gets the 2 votes gets all electoral college votes. No, I mean, 55% vote, 40% vote, 30% vote. It's still legitimate. There's no minimum requirement. So either make it illegal to not vote, like they do in Australia, or take into account the 60, 70 million people who didn't participate, and you can't call it a mandate when 2/3 or 1/3 of the eligible voters don't cast a vote.
I want to go back to how do you deal with this transition when you live in a time of a rising international order that is very authoritarian, crony capitalism, and actually likes chaos and division. So for keeping allies accountable, like Saudi Arabia, if there's no sanctions, or at least targeted things like the Magnitsky Act, where you're targeting individuals, and how do you deal with them? They don't care. Like they'll get their weapons from another country if we don't give it to them. So without actually doing something like sanctions where it hurts the individuals in power, how do you affect change? And it's not just about that. I also worry as a Black person, I think also it gets lost, is that, like, for example, in the last election, kind of trying to disenfranchise, like with the targeting of the Black community and other communities not to vote. And this is going to continue if we try to transition into a lower security budget, for example. All these big and multi international corporations that are in charge of the weapons complex, they're just gonna, I see them being hand in hand with the other authoritarian countries and just trying to, all you have to do is just suppress the vote and cause more division in our country, and they'll just stay status quo. Nothing's going to change. You could come in power for one term, and then they're like, okay, we need to get our act together, go with our allies internationally that want authoritarianism, and just get these progressive out of office and just make it so they can't come back in. Like, yeah.
I thought you called on me, you know. Is that,
I'm going to call on 3 people before they stand in the line.
I had 2 questions about how the media covers U.S. military action abroad. The first being, given how horrific and kind of some acts you hear about, like a Navy SEAL slitting the throat of a 15-year-old boy, like I just would feel like it's so sensational that the media, you would see more of it. So I wonder, like it would sell papers even, like. And the other question, I guess, is I see, I felt like in the kind of mainstream liberal press, I saw after the mosque shooting in New Zealand, editorials saying that this was like somehow exporting U.S. violence abroad, but I saw less of that, like when a U.S.-made bomb blows up a school bus in Yemen. So I'm wondering why.
and Steve, since you're going to call on people, I'll just hand mics directly to folks.
Let me, if I could just pick up on your media point, something we didn't talk about, but we were going to, is we've been subjected to a kind of public rehabilitation tour of intel and security officials who have been known to have lied to Congress, who have been known to have abused our rights and values, not just in this period, but their institutions abuse civil liberties, civil rights organizations. And there was a guy named William Arkin, who writes about defense issues, resigned from MSNBC, NBC about a month ago, sent an open letter decrying the fact that you have these officials invested in the escalation of military conflict, not the de-escalation, basically guiding and narrating every night the news around of what's happening in the world. And I think we need to think very hard, and this is something that a public campaign, movements could drive, just as we need other people to testify before Congress. If you look at some of the hearings, it's just outrageous. It's a suffocating consensus of discredited failure. We need other voices, not just on our screens, but our pixels. We need Aziz to be on MSNBC. We need debates and discussions that inform, because how do people get their news? How do they form their reality? Often from the media. Your first issue might be healthcare or war and peace. Your second better be the media, because that's how it's framing. So I think our media, for the most part, does a pretty lousy job, and it's playing a role. But people, movements, alternative ways of getting news, breaking through the gatekeepers, not fully successful because you get a lot of crap, but has played a role. And I would simply say about the legitimacy of our elections, no, I mean, it's a failed election process, which I spoke to. I think we would do better to rebuild our election democracy at home before we go out and try and convert others. And I think the issue of suppressing the vote is critical. And there's been a lot of attention to the Russian interference with social media, but there better be a hell of a lot of attention to those who, for example, are trying to suppress the right of ex-felons to be reenfranchised in Florida, or Koch brother, dark money, coursing, metastasizing through our system.
First, quickly on the media, that just as Katrina suggested, the rehabilitation of a national security establishment as quote-unquote part of the resistance is, to me, one of the most disturbing elements of the last couple years. So I'd ask you this. When was the last time that Robert Mueller's name was referenced and folks talked about his role as head of the FBI post 9/11? He was head of the FBI when the FBI initiated Pent Bomb, which was its investigation to 9/11, and as part of that engaged in mass suspicionless sweeps of Arab and Muslim people, over 5,000 folks. And when those people sued the US government, a case that the Supreme Court then essentially squashed, for their prison beatings and abuse, Mueller was a named defendant. But you'd think that the man was Elliot Ness, based on how he's presented. To me, I mean, this is a significant example of the kind of impunity that runs from him to Clapper to Gina Haspel. And it's tied to, I think, a fundamental problem in the American political discourse that media reproduces, which is when it comes to American power, the country and the media establishment are in a kind of permanent present. Like, the idea is that American intentions are always good. It just so happens that for some reason unbeknownst to everybody, the outcomes are systematically terrible for the people that are supposed to be the benefits of uplift. And rather than thinking about, well, maybe there's a connection between how the policies are structured and these events, these two things are kept utterly separate. So it doesn't matter like what actually happens on the ground or what violence is visited upon people, because the presumption is whatever the US did was good, and it was just like in the implementation or the folks on the ground. And so you just proceed apace with the next set of kind of interventions and actions. But very quickly on the electoral system, this is one of the reasons why I think you have to think of these issues as connected. The US is not now and has never been truly democratic. It has an electoral system that's organized around mass disenfranchisement and a constitutional structure that makes social change very, very difficult. You have to have effectively supermajorities to overcome all of these different kinds of veto points. And thinking about transforming the American project at home and abroad really requires an insurgent campaign on behalf of democracy. And that was how folks in the labor movement understood many of their objectives, even if they didn't seem like they were quote-unquote procedural, like the right to strike or collective bargaining. And folks within the African-American civil rights movement understood what they were doing as well. And to the extent that the system, the political system, remains broken and dysfunctional in the way it is, you're going to have a legislative branch that can't operate. You're going to have power that ends up accruing to the executive in a way that produces a kind of imperial presidency. And so all of these things actually have to be grappled together, and I couldn't agree more about the voter disenfranchisement question. And on the last point, which is, I think it's really important to separate between the politics of economic sanctions and a principle of anti-impunity. And what's happened is the traditional national security establishment has basically collapsed the two. Economic sanctions as a general practice, as an instrument of foreign policy, primarily hurt those that are impoverished within countries. But if you're committed to anti-impunity, you'd say, well, wait a second. If you're a corporation, actually have thick rules domestically and internationally. If you're a corporation that's engaged in like the violation of the basic labor rights of your employees, or that avoids paying your fair share of taxes, like, try, folks. Like, use the criminal system and civil sanction as a way of actually constraining the actions of those individuals. If you're a member of the national security state that's engaged in mass violence, you should be held accountable. It is an outrage that in this country you can be a non-citizen and accidentally vote and serve a prison sentence of 5 years in Texas, while in that same state you have officials in ICE and the DHS that are engaged in human rights infringements of a truly, disproportionate and mass nature when it comes to the separation of children. Who is it that should be accountable for what crimes and what even counts as a crime?
All right, let me get three more questions here. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I got what it is.
Steve, can you actually choose one person on this side?
Right there. Okay, you're number 3.
They're on the left.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, you're sitting in the wrong
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, how we think about a potential Green New Deal. So thinking of a Green New Deal that doesn't become a second Marshall Plan, so demilitarizing or decoupling development from the potential it has to sort of expand the liberal interventionist order into this, new climate crisis.
So mine is that you talked about post-independence leaders, particularly in the developing world. But then I think it is also important to recognize the fact that most of these post-independent leaders got caught up in the Cold War. And so it became impossible to build these necessary social democratic foundations that were needed for these developing countries to spring up and grow. So the question is, how do we deal meaningfully with such issues as the Palestinian crisis without necessarily being seen as anti-Israel? And how do we draw lessons from supporting such groups as the Mujahideen in the blowback and support for anti-democratic forces in places like Iraq and the blowback? And then for actions like the intervention in Libya and the blowback, and all these failed states that have been created as a result of these interventions and practices. And secondly, it looks like the rest of the world sits back and watch the projection of neoliberal policies and the inability to grow the very social democratic foundations that we need for these developing countries to survive and thrive, because the IMF and the World Bank is projecting and pushing down all these neoliberal policies, particularly in the developing countries, because, for example, I come from Ghana, and 60% of the budget of the Republic of Ghana is funded through donor sources, particularly through the IMF and the World Bank. So it becomes almost impossible to develop and grow any social democratic foundation, which is essential for these countries to thrive.
Let me get the right-wing person.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Thanks for all these insights, the speakers. One of you mentioned the idea of integrating this new approach to our relationship to the rest of the world into the lives of ordinary people. And I just want to raise that one a little bit. I think we certainly can see that there are strands through which that's happening, like the fatigue with war, like the last generation of anti-war groups that got some into the working class, like Military Families Speak Out and About Face, and the mothers and grandmothers, and people of faith. But in the U.S., there's plenty of oppression and exploitation, but many of us live in relative stability. And if you look at the rest of the world, you see people who, their relatives are blown up by a misplaced drone strike at a wedding, or there's hundreds of thousands of people are moving because you can't live on the land anymore because of drought. So for ordinary people, I think when you really start to think about this, it can be almost paralyzing, and there's a tendency to denial or to say, well, it must be because those people are stupid or they have bad cultures or something like that. And well, I totally agree with the idea of, educating around the defense budget and how we need to lessen it to do things that'll better people's lives. I think that more is needed than that kind of just rational approach that helps people grapple with it in their souls, kind of, and really deal with what the rest of the world is going through, largely because of the people who rule us here.
Could I speak just very briefly to that? With humility, I would submit that there are large parts of this country which do live in turmoil and under oppression. And I think there was, after 9/11, an attempt to connect, for example, the policing in cities to the policing globally, to connect the actual police architecture and arms. I think Bob Dreyfus, in fact, wrote a little bit about this. But, I mean, you were bringing home 9/11 into communities and the arrest, as you described, and the pushback by police chiefs. But, there are many communities in this country which do feel close to home the impact of endless war, of this hyper-militarization. People may have followed the study of 60 counties in 2016, which went for Trump because he lied about his opposition to turmoil in the Middle East, but these were communities which were hardest hit. These were multiple deployments, maimed, wounded, killed, suicides, people in those, sons and daughters in those communities. So I do think over the years, and again, this may be way too rational, but there have been like city council resolutions opposed to escalating conflict with Iran, opposed to the war in Iraq, trying to de-escalate. And I think if you can bring it home locally, find ways which are both emotional and rational, I think there's a possibility to do something which has not been done in our history, and Aziz writes about this, the fundamental disconnect between the foreign policy national security establishment and people is fundamentally undemocratic, and we need to democratize. We were talking about democratization. We need to democratize foreign policy. We need to make sure voices are heard which haven't been heard, communities are heard from which haven't been heard from. And I think that's a project that we can begin and drive.
Very powerfully stated. So I think I'll probably focus on the other two questions. So the first about Green New Deal and the Marshall Plan. To me, the Marshall Plan, so the Marshall Plan should be understood as a conscious alternative to a global New Deal, something that you had elements within the Black freedom struggle, as well as politicians like Wallace, that were very seriously thinking about. And the idea was that in a context of global destruction, the US should use its economic surplus to dramatically lift the boats of all and to reduce various forms of poverty and inequality based on the principle that the well-being of all would then end up limiting and de-escalating violence. The approach that emerged through the national security framework and that Truman really became sort of like a centerpiece of was the idea that no, what you're going to do is you're going to use surplus and stimulus to strengthen allies in the struggle against the Soviet Union and to show that there's actually like a path to economic betterment through supporting the US versus supporting the Soviet Union. And that ends up creating, in the 50s and beyond, a tense and militarized world that, deals with issues of poverty in Western European allies, but actually reproduces profound forms of fracture. And at the very least, one way to think about it in the present is not have these kinds of political conditionalities where alliance is tied to economic largesse, and actually think really seriously about how you can use global anti-poverty commitments as a way of actually improving the conditions of people everywhere. So take as the foundation, essentially, the path not employed. And then I just say, secondly, that I see a significant part of the contemporary problem for the US is the fact that American power is not going anywhere. All this stuff about like America in decline, yes, they're rising powers, but American power is still a profound force in global relations. The problem, in a way, is it's now, even at the level of justification, like utterly disconnected from grounding principles. So you have power that's operating without any legitimating rationale and without any seeming like guiding purpose. And in a sense, at the very least, this is again, these are not radical suggestions, that we should expect politicians that we vote for, that those occasional opportunities that we have to pull the lever, to say, to our own allies, first, let alone rethink the alliances, which I think we should be in the business of doing, that we are not going to bankroll or support our allies that are engaged in mass infringements of basic rights. And that's how I see the politics of Israel-Palestine. I think that it is emblematic of a profound corrosion in the exercise of American authority. It limits and constrains the ability to take international law seriously as any kind of restraint. It undermines our ability to operate in the context of the UN, and it speaks to the fact that if this power persists, like the power should at least be applied to our allies in ways that say we are not going to be in the business of supporting policies that fundamentally conflict with the interests of our people here and self-determination commitments of those abroad.
We have, I think, time for one more round of 3 questions. 1, 2,
This has been a terrific panel. I'm so glad I came to this. Thank you. One of the themes that have been repeated several times is this notion of limiting government, limiting war. And I want to ask you a question on a practical way to do that. And this has to do also with the notion of power to the people. And so every government claims two powers: the police power, which is the monopoly on the legal use of force. Nobody's questioning that. But the other is the power of the purse. And people in this country believe that the power of the purse is limited by the provision in the Constitution that requires all spending to originate with the bill in the House, the idea being that the House is the closest to the people. But no, they have omitted even thinking about the monetary provisions in the Constitution, which require gold and silver as our money. And that would leave the sovereignty over the power of the purse to the people. And so in terms of war, you could not have the Vietnam War if they had to come to the people, if Johnson had to say, I'm going to raise taxes. And if you get rid of paper money, the only way for the government to get that money would be to tax it or to borrow it. And the Constitution already provides for gold and silver as money. So would you talk to that issue, please?
I've been having a debate with someone about a U.S. intervention in Syria, and he was arguing that the U.S. is only helping the Kurds there and not helping Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. Plus, Assad has used chemical weapons on his people, which I tried to argue against, and he came back and said, well, the other side did use them, but not as much as Assad. Anyway, I just want to know what a powerful argument I could make to this guy about total non-intervention, especially with the issue of, oh, they're only helping, the U.S. is only helping the Kurds. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a really fruitful discussion. I guess just to get, if you could do a sort of thought experiment, let's say whichever candidate is the best, Bernie or Warren, whoever you think, or even somebody slightly better, becomes president in 2021, and progressive people that we generally like have influence in the Senate and the House. But the larger balance of forces and all kinds of global and military-industrial complex forces are still, playing out as they would in the next couple of years. What are the best-case scenarios of what the first 100 days and the first 18 months of a somewhat progressive White House and Congress would look like in 2021, 2022? What are the worst-case scenarios where even with those people in power, these contradictions fall through? And what are some of those dynamics that we have to be vigilant about? And I think really the war on terror has not been explicitly discussed enough. And it's just one provocation. As these left foreign policy discussions come up, there's a lot of think pieces about working with Russia, working with China, respecting Assad. But most U.S. militarism is not aimed at Russia or China or Assad. It's aimed, the only state that's going to be really targeted is Iran, but it's mostly non-state peoples around the world that, as others have mentioned, I mean, the U.S. can work with Russia and China on bombing countries as well. And those global war on terror consensus pervades into the left and would likely pervade even if a progressive Democrat becomes president. So just some of those thought scenarios, because hopefully it won't be disastrous and it's not going to be perfect. So what could it look like, and how do we be vigilant about that?
Well, let me, on your point about the budget, stripping away some of the complexities, I think just simply to restore Congress as having a role in authorizing budgets, interventions, even the use of nuclear weapons, which we haven't talked much about, would play some restraining role. There have to be other restraints. In terms of the first 100 days, well, if we're at in military conflict with Iran next week, and we are also in conflict with North Korea, and there is another regime change war, someone coming in, whether it's Bernie Sanders or any progressive, and there are not that many progressives on foreign policy running. That's a different discussion. I think you face some real structural problems. I mean, you face a bureaucratic apparatus of enormous power and support. The best that you could do is begin to assemble a list of people who should be in such an administration, so you at least have a bench of support, find allies in Congress and find allies in social movements, and develop that, and bring in Aziz as a counselor on issues of first principles. But seriously, it's a long struggle, but as Aziz said, this is an extraordinary moment where for the first time in many years, there may be more of a debate around not just foreign policy, but principles of American engagement with the world in this campaign. And that could open up some new terrain. And it shouldn't just be limited to the presidential. I suggest that all of you look at the Progressive Caucus. There are a few people, particularly Ro Khanna, who's someone who's anti-colonialist, anti-interventionist, who is someone who believes in restraint and a kind of progressive realism. These are people who are trying to think anew and have played a role with the War Powers Act. But there are far more radical steps that need to be taken, but you asked about the first 100 days.
So quickly, instead of getting into the kind of the constitutional debates, I would just say that I understand some of the suspicion about fiscal and monetary policy, but there's also a really long tradition on the left of saying that we need to democratize credit. And one of the ways that you democratize credit, in other words, make it more readily available to people so that they have access to spending, is through paper money and through various uses of a central bank. I mean, the contemporary problem is the way in which these institutions have been applied instead to serve a set of corporate interests, but that doesn't mean that we should effectively throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's my own view. On Syria, my position about Syria, and I've written with Asla Bali, a co-author of mine that's incredibly knowledgeable about the Middle East. I recommend reading anything she writes. But we've written a number of pieces, including 2 last summer in the Boston Review about Syria policy in particular. We've been opponents from the get-go of the it was Hillary Clinton's State Department, but the Clinton-Obama administration approach to Syria, which was effectively to play a role in escalating the conflict based on the idea that if the U.S. put like a small thumb on the hand in favor of certain oppositional groups, then there would be a tipping point and Assad would fall without realizing the extent to which Assad was really central to the regional alliances of both Russia and Iran. So we opposed that on those very, simple pragmatic grounds, and also on the grounds that the U.S. has not been very good at intervention. And the idea of imagining that you could have these interventions that are then going to produce the outcomes you want, I think, is highly suspect. So our basic principles for how the U.S. should operate, including right now in the context of what's happening in Idlib with the possibility of another final kind of confrontation, is one, because of the U.S.'s role, partial though it may be in escalating the conflict, that it should be committed to bringing in displaced persons and refugees. We say 400,000 over the next 4 years, a number that's in a way equivalent to the number of Vietnamese that the U.S. brought in the wake of the Vietnam War. 2, systematically commit to humanitarian rebuilding and support reconstruction for a country that we played a role in thoroughly destroying. 3, commit to a comprehensive diplomatic negotiation round. A large part of what was failed about U.S. foreign policy in Syria was that the U.S. began with a position that it would not negotiate with Iran in ways that ended up really undermining the capacity of having a comprehensive diplomatic solution at a much earlier period. And then 4, I think that as part of the backdrop, we have to really seriously consider our relationship with Iran more generally, that in many ways the current policy is to treat Syria as a kind of proxy for isolating Iran, and then showing that we can do business in various ways with Russia, and all of this has to be reconceived. Now, you'll notice that my position is not, totally isolationist. I'm an internationalist, and I think especially given the role that the U.S. plays abroad, that, the idea of just absolute retreat is another form of destruction, that there has to be a way of thinking really in a sophisticated manner about like what international obligations consist in without necessarily falling back into the presumption that it has to be through violence and that it can be compatible with the do no harm principle. And then I guess just the last thought, which is many years ago, some friends of mine and I in New York City, we had a little tiny organization called Against the War on Terror. This is in 2005, 2006, when it was something truly transgressive. So I couldn't agree more with the point that, and this is, I think, a significant marker of difference between the left and, let's say, the mainstream Democratic Party, the folks that are viewed as the non-hawks. It can't just be opposition to a particular eruption of intervention, a war of choice, let's say in Iraq. There has to be opposition to the framework, a commitment to ending the global war on terror itself. And if I'm most hopeful, what I imagine is that there's actually ways that you can see a coalition of anti-interventionist, anti-militarist folks in Congress, as well as, let's say, with a Sanders White House, that could use the tools of the executive branch as well as the legislative one to press for some of the kind of concrete policy suggestions that I presented earlier, from like transparently counting civilians, not using drone strikes in the context of armed conflicts, getting rid of a whole bunch of these economic sanctions, and on and on and on. Now,
repealing the authorization, AUMF.
Repeal the.
It's been a license.
Repeal the 9/11 AUMF. I mean, there's lots of ways that we can imagine a kind of concrete politics. The concern that I have is the one that Katrina raised, which is for all of like the far right's talk about the quote unquote deep state. Like the simple truth is that both electoral and constitutional constraints, as well as the built-in bureaucracy of the state, and like the courts, frankly, the Supreme Court is also out there. There is a massive infrastructure that would constrain the possibility of successfully implementing either domestic or transformative foreign policy. The reason why the New Deal achievements, to the extent that they were partially successful in the 30s and 40s, is because not only did you have a massively organized labor movement with real institutional power, the power to shut down the economy at the point of production, but you also had dramatic rolling supermajorities that could overcome all of these veto points. And still, you only had partial achievements. Right now, you have a resurgent left. The intellectual ideas of the left, in many ways, are the ideas that are, cresting like the top of the wave. It's the center and the right that is intellectually exhausted. But the left does not have the institutional bases of support or the kind of institutional forms of power, and it confronts massive structural constraints. And that's essentially the problem of the present. But I'll say this, in some ways, that's a lot better than having this conversation in the 1990s. And so we have to struggle with what's hopeful and what's tragic about this moment.
Thank you for coming. Please subscribe to New Labor Forum on the way out. And I want. And his Aziz's article is in the issue that's out there, so you can read that. And I want to thank our speakers.